Title: The Korean Mafia boss treated the waitress like trash until he saw the photo in her apron and realized who she really was. Chapter 1: The photograph falls. The restaurant hummed with quiet wealth. Crystal clinked, low laughter drifted between tables, and the scent of truffle reduction hung like a status symbol in the air. Amara Osai moved between those tables with the efficiency of someone who had learned to be invisible. Water refilled before it was asked for, breadbasket replenished before it emptied. Herself noticed as little as possible. She liked it that way. It was Kwon Yi-hyun who broke that invisible peace. He arrived at 9:47 p.m. with 5 men who all wore the same expression, the practiced blankness of people paid never to react. Yi-hyun himself was the kind of man a room noticed before it understood why. Early 30s, jawline cut sharp as a verdict, wearing a charcoal suit worth more than this restaurant's monthly rent. He sat without looking at the chair. His men surrounded the table like a perimeter. Amara approached with menus and a professional smile. "Good evening. Welcome to water," he said, not to her, to the table. As if the word were a command addressed to the air, and she was simply the mechanism that would execute it. She brought water. Then wine he did not order from the menu but described in 3 Korean words to one of his men, who repeated it to Amara in English, still not looking at her. When she set down the bottle, her sleeve caught the edge of his glass. A small wobble. Nothing spilled. But Yi-hyun looked at her, then really looked, with an expression she knew well. The look that said, "You are a problem that exists in my space." "Be careful," he said, quiet, precise. The way a man speaks when he's used to those 2 words having consequences. Amara held his gaze for exactly 1 second. "Of course. My apologies." She went back to her station. She pressed her hand flat against her apron pocket, a habit, a reflex, feeling the slight rectangular weight of the photograph she always kept there. A folded picture, soft at the edges from months of being touched like a talisman. She did not take it out, not yet. The shift wore on. Yi-hyun's table ordered rarely and demanded constantly. At 11:15, as Amara cleared the final course, her apron pocket snagged on the edge of a dessert cart. The photograph slipped free, tumbling face up onto the marble floor between her feet and his. She reached for it. He reached for it. His hand closed around it first. She watched his face. Watched the precise moment the photograph registered the 2 figures in it. The location she recognized, and he clearly did too. The handwriting in the corner. The blood drained from Kwon Yi-hyun's face so completely it looked like a power outage behind his eyes. "Where?" he said, and his voice had changed entirely. The command bled out of it, something raw and almost careful in its place. "Did you get this?" Amara straightened. She looked at him the way she had not permitted herself to look at him all night, directly, fully, as an equal. "That man in the photograph," she said quietly, "is my father." Restaurant breathed around them. Yi-hyun's men exchanged glances for the first time all evening. And Kwon Yi-hyun, the man who did not look at chairs before he sat in them, the man who addressed his water to the room, sat very, very still. Chapter 2: The Weight of Invisible. 3 hours earlier. Amara had learned something in 8 months of waitressing in Seoul. Wealth has a sound. Not the sound of money being spent. Anyone could spend money loudly. The real sound of wealth was subtler. It was the absence of uncertainty. It was people who moved through spaces as though the spaces had been designed around them, because usually they had. Kwon Yi-hyun had that sound before he pushed through the door. The floor manager, Mr. Song, materialized at the host stand and greeted him in a low, deferential register Amara had never heard him use with anyone else. A regular, clearly. Important. The kind of important that made Mr. Song's spine quietly disappear. The reservation had not existed 20 minutes ago. Now it did. Table 4, the best table, the one Amara had been assigned, was apparently his preference. "Serve table 4 tonight," Mr. Song told her. Not asked. His voice had the tight quality of a man managing his own anxiety. "Be professional. Don't engage. Don't make conversation. Just be invisible." She had almost smiled. She had been practicing invisible for 8 months. She was very good at it. What she hadn't practiced, what no amount of preparation made easy, was being treated as though she were furniture that had inconveniently developed the ability to make mistakes. The first 15 minutes were professional enough. Yi Hyun ignored her in the clean, transactional way busy men ignored service staff. She could work with that. What she could not work with, what arrived 40 minutes in with his second glass of wine, was his companion's comment. One of the men at the table made a remark in Korean that made the others laugh. Amara did not speak enough Korean to catch all of it. She caught enough. She caught the word for decoration and the word for lost, and she caught the gesture, a slight incline of the chin in her direction. She kept her face still. Set down the breadbasket, turned to go. Your Korean, Yi Hyun said behind her, is poor. She turned back, waited. My Korean is improving, she said, neutral, without apology. He looked at her with that same appraising flatness, the look that took inventory without the courtesy of seeing. You've been in Seoul how long? 8 months. A small sound. Not quite a laugh, not quite contempt. The distance between those two things compressed into a single exhale. He looked back at his wine. She was dismissed. At the service station, she straightened the silverware that didn't need straightening. She pressed her hand to her apron pocket, felt the photograph, thought about her father's voice the last time they'd spoken. Be patient, Amara girl. The world reveals itself to people who are willing to be still long enough to see it. She breathed. She returned to the table. She was, as instructed, invisible, until the photograph made her otherwise. Chapter 3. The General's Daughter. There are two kinds of photographs. There are the kind you take to remember something, and there are the kind you carry because they remind you of who you are when the world is working very hard to make you forget. Amara's photograph was the second kind. It had been taken 14 years ago, at a compound in the mountains north of Seoul that most people in that city did not know existed. In the photograph, a younger Amara, 11 years old, gap-toothed, delighted, stood beside a man twice her size. Her father, General Kwon D-sung, not a military general. The title was honorific, bestowed by the men who answered to him the old way. The way titles were given in the underground infrastructure of power that ran beneath Seoul's polished surface like load-bearing cables. Kwon D-sung had built that infrastructure over 30 years. He had mediated disputes between families, brokered agreements between rivals, and ensured that the machinery of the city's shadow economy moved without catastrophic friction. He had done all of this and also coached Amara's weekend football team when she was 8, burned the rice without fail every Sunday morning, and cried openly at her university graduation. 14 years after the photograph, Kwon D-sung was retired, genuinely, completely retired, in the way that men of his particular stature can retire when they have made themselves so useful for so long that their absence becomes its own form of power. He lived now in Accra, Ghana, the country of Amara's mother, tending an enormous garden and video calling his daughter every Sunday. His daughter, who had followed her mother's nationality to Ghana for her own upbringing, then her own curiosity to Seoul, telling almost no one whose blood ran in her veins. Amara had not hidden her father's identity to protect herself. She had hidden it because she had spent enough time in rooms where her father's name changed how people looked at her, too fast, too much. The calculation behind the eyes going from 0 to fever pitch in a single second, and she had grown tired of never knowing whether she herself was being seen at all. So she had come to Seoul as just Amara Osai. Mother's name, her own face, no shadow of legacy preceding her. What she had not anticipated, what no one ever anticipated, was that a photograph she carried purely for herself would become the thing that made her visible to the man currently holding it with hands that had gone very slightly unsteady. Kwon Yi Hyun stared at the photograph, at the handwriting in the lower corner. His own name, written there 14 years ago by a man who had, in a different season of both their lives, been something close to a mentor. D-sung had written it to show a young Amara. This is someone I trust. Remember this face. She wondered, watching Yi Hyun's expression do something complicated and involuntary, whether he had ever imagined that instruction traveling in the opposite direction. Chapter 4. The accounting. He did not give the photograph back immediately. He held it for 3 seconds, she counted, then placed it on the table between them with a care that was so different from every other gesture he'd made all evening that it landed like a confession. "Sit down," he said, then caught himself. Something moved across his face. "Please, I'm working," Amara said. "I know." He said it with an awareness of what those words meant that he had not demonstrated 2 hours ago. 5 minutes, please. She sat. Across the table, Kwon Yi-hyun looked at her with the photograph between them and the particular expression of a man whose map of the world has just been reprinted with a significant feature added. The men around him had gone very quiet. "Your father," he said carefully, "knows you're in Seoul. He does, working here." Does a pause. He picked up his wine glass, did not drink from it, set it down. "Why?" "Because," Amara said, "I wanted to know what the city was like when it wasn't performing for me." She watched his face. "When I'm just the waitress, people show me who they are. No one is performing. No one is trying to impress the general's daughter." A beat. "It's clarifying," she did not say, "including you." She did not need to. She watched him hear it anyway. The color had returned to his face, but it had redistributed, less command, more something he was calculating. He was a man who had grown up learning to read situations at speed. She could see him reading this one. "Owe you an apology," he said. The words arrived without flinching, which surprised her. She had expected negotiation. She had expected him to reach for the photograph as a mutual exchange. "I know who you are, now let's erase the previous 2 hours. Instead, he said, "I was dismissive. It's not how I was raised to be." Amara agreed. "It's how people let themselves become when they have power and no one will say anything." He absorbed that. She noticed that he absorbed it without deflecting, which elevated him slightly in her estimation, not enough to undo the evening, but enough to make her willing to continue the conversation. "General Kwon," he said, and the name in his mouth carried weight she recognized, the weight of formative years, of a young man being shaped in rooms she hadn't been old enough to enter. "He spoke about you. Even then, he called you his compass." Yi-hyun glanced at the photograph. "I didn't know what he meant. I was 22. I thought it was sentiment." Now he looked at her directly. "I think I understand the word better than I did." Outside, a car idled. The restaurant had emptied without Amara noticing. The staff moved at the edges of the room with the practiced discretion of people who understood that something was happening at table 4 that was not their business. "My father," Amara said, "would want me to tell you something." She folded the photograph, tucked it back into her apron pocket. "He would want me to say that the measure of a man who has power is not what he does with it when the world is watching. It's what he does with it when he thinks no one important will ever find out." Yi-hyun was quiet for a long moment. "He told me something similar," he said finally. "A long time ago. I should have remembered it better." 5 The street at midnight. Amara collected her things from the staff room at midnight. When she stepped out through the restaurant's side entrance into the sodium-orange quiet of the street, Yi-hyun was there, not with his men, not performing anything, just standing under the awning with his jacket loosened and his hands in his pockets, like someone who had made a decision and was waiting to see if it held. She stopped. He registered her surprise and, to his credit, did not pretend it wasn't there. "I asked my driver to wait," he said. "I told myself I wasn't going to linger, but I wanted to say something properly, and the inside felt too much like. It felt like the wrong room." Amara set her bag on her shoulder. Around them, Seoul carried on without interest. A delivery scooter hummed past. Somewhere 2 blocks west, someone's karaoke broke free of its building and floated upward. A food stall on the corner threw warmth and garlic into the cold air. "What room would be right?" she asked. He considered this with a seriousness she was beginning to recognize as native to him, not performance, but the default processing mode of a man who had spent years in situations where a wrong reading cost more than embarrassment. "Somewhere I'm not the person who behaved badly. I needed a reset." He paused. "I'm not sure this street qualifies, but it's the best I have." "Qualifies," she said, which was more than she had planned to give him, but she found it was true. They walked without agreeing to walk, simply found themselves moving along the pavement toward a quieter stretch, where the restaurant's glow faded and the city's ambient light took over. Yi-hyun spoke first. "Been thinking about what you said, about power and what it reveals." He was quiet for a beat. "I've been thinking that the people in my life who might challenge me on that, who I'd actually hear it from, there are fewer of them than there should be. I built a perimeter around myself that keeps certain kinds of honesty out." Amara walked. She let the words settle without filling the space around them. "Your father was the last person who spoke to me that way," he said. "Directly, without needing anything from me. He was the only person in certain rooms who never seemed to want anything in return for his honesty." A pause. "I didn't know what to do with that when I was 22. I was too young to understand that it was the rarest thing he could have given me." "Gives it freely," Amara said. "He always has. It's the only currency he trusts." Yi Hyun glanced at her sideways. Something in his expression had softened from whatever the restaurant version of him had been, not weaker, but more accurately drawn. This, she thought, was probably closer to who he actually was. "He mentioned you," he said, "even when you were young enough that I wouldn't have thought to ask." He said, "My daughter is the only person who has ever made me feel that my accounting was incomplete, as if you were the auditor he'd always needed." A small pause. "I thought he meant it as affection." "Did," Amara said. "He also meant it literally." Yi Hyun made a sound that might, from another man in another register, have been a laugh. Here it was something quieter, the sound of a person encountering clarity they had not expected and were not sure they deserved. They stopped at a pedestrian crossing. The light was red. Neither of them had anywhere to be. "I don't want to use this," he said carefully. "The photograph, the connection, I want to be clear about that." Amara looked at him. "I know," she said simply. And she did, not because she was naive, but because the photograph had not produced in him the fever-pitch calculation she had seen in other people's eyes when her father's name entered the room. What it had produced was something older and less comfortable. Something that looked, if she was reading it right, like accountability. The light turned green. She walked. "Good night, Kwon Yi Hyun," she said, without looking back. Behind her, she heard him stand at the crossing a beat longer than necessary before his footsteps turned in the other direction. She pressed her hand to her apron pocket, felt the photograph, kept walking. Chapter 6. The compass call Sunday came with its usual geometry. Amara's phone at 9 a.m., the call connected before the second ring, her father's face filling the screen with evidence of across sunlight, golden and unhurried, the light of a man who had genuinely stopped rushing. "Amara girl." Kwon Di-sung's voice was the same it had always been, deep, warm, textured with the specific confidence of someone who had never needed volume to be heard. "You look tired. Did you sleep?" "I slept." "You look like a man who has been in his garden since dawn, since 5. He showed her his hands soil under the fingernails, proud as medals. "The tomatoes are finally happening. Your mother says I talk to them too much." He squinted at the screen. What happened this week? She had told herself she might not mention it. She had known from the moment she picked up the phone that she would. "I had a customer," she said, "who saw the photograph." The garden sounds behind her father went on bird call, light wind, but Di-sung himself went very still in the way that had once made rooms of dangerous men straighten their spines without understanding why. "Which customer?" Kwon Yi Hyun. Silence. Then, and this was the thing about her father that she had never been able to predict and never stopped being moved by, he laughed. A real laugh, deep and long, the laugh of a man who has just been told the punchline to a joke he set up 14 years ago. "Yi Hyun," he said when the laughing settled. "In your restaurant. Treating me like I was part of the furniture," Amara said. "Until he wasn't." Her father looked at her with eyes that were doing several things at once, taking inventory, remembering, measuring the distance between what he had hoped for and what he was being told. "How did he behave when he understood?" "He apologized," she said, "without being cornered into it, outside the restaurant, on the street, without an audience." Di-sung was quiet for a moment. Did it feel real? It felt like someone reckoning with arithmetic they had avoided for a long time. She paused. "Yes." It felt real. Her father nodded slowly. In the background, a crowd moved. A neighbor's radio, the distant percussion of a city that lived outdoors. "I put his name on that photograph," he said, "when you were 11 years old. You had just asked me how you would know who the trustworthy people were in a world full of people performing trustworthiness." He looked at the screen. "I told you, watch what they do with power when they're certain no one important is watching. I wrote his name down as a test case." "A bet told me about the bet," Amara said. "He said he didn't know it was still open." "Bets don't close," her father said, and she recognized her own words from the street returning to her, the sentence that had apparently been circulating in the family so long it had lost its origin point. "They only settle." He studied his daughter through the screen. "And what is your read?" "My read," Amara said, "is that he is someone who confused force with strength for a long time, and that he is perhaps old enough now to understand the difference, but that understanding it and living it are different distances." Her father said, "They are." He picked up a pair of gardening shears and set them down again, a gesture she recognized as him processing. "I am glad you are there," he said finally. "Not because of him, because of you. Because you are doing the thing I always hoped you would, learning the world by standing inside it without your name as a shield." He looked at her directly. "Are you all right?" "All right," she said, and meant it. "Good." He held up the phone to show her a section of garden tomatoes, improbably red, luminous with attention. "Now, let me tell you about these tomatoes. Your mother thinks I am obsessive, but I want you to look at these and tell me honestly whether obsession is not entirely justified." She laughed. The Sunday call went on for another 40 minutes. She did not think about Kwon Yi-hyun for the rest of the day. She thought about her father's garden and her mother's voice she could hear in the background, and the specific quality of light in Accra that she had carried in her chest like a second compass for as long as she could remember. That, she thought, was the thing about knowing exactly who you were. It made every other question answerable. Chapter 7. The test of the bet. The call came on a Thursday. Yi Hyun was in his office when Park Sung-jin, a man whose name appeared on the correct letterheads of 3 logistics companies and the actual ownership structures of several others, settled into the chair across the desk and placed a folder between them. "D-Sung connection," Sung-jin said, without preamble, which was his style and one of the few things Yi Hyun had ever respected about him. "It's more current than anyone knew." Yi Hyun did not touch the folder. "Meaning?" "Meaning his daughter has been in Seoul for 8 months. Meaning she is, for reasons that remain unclear, working as a server at Murray." Sung-jin's tone was the practiced neutrality of a man laying facts on a table and inviting someone else to feel things about them. "Meaning there is a relationship there, or the beginning of one that, managed correctly, could function as a direct channel to D-Sung's network, which, as you know, remains structurally intact even in retirement." "Network is his," Yi Hyun said. "He retired, that was the agreement." "Agreements," Sung-jin said pleasantly, "are renegotiated when the landscape changes. He has a daughter in Seoul. You have a slight pause, a slight lift of the eyebrow, point of contact. This is not a complicated calculation." Yi Hyun looked at the folder. He thought about a marble floor, a dropped photograph, hands that had gone briefly unsteady. He thought about the voice of a man he had not seen in 11 years saying, in a room in the mountains north of this city, that the only thing worth building was something you could look at honestly and not need to rename. He thought about a woman on a pedestrian crossing at midnight, not looking back, pressing her hand to her apron pocket as she walked. "Close the folder," he said. Sung-jin blinked. The potential return on "close it." Office was quiet. Outside, Seoul went about its business 23 floors below. Sung-jin closed the folder slowly, with the expression of a man recalibrating an assessment he had thought complete. "She is not a channel," Yi Hyun said. "She is not a connection to be managed. She is a person who has done nothing to you, to me, or to anyone in this room, and she is in this city on her own terms for her own reasons." He looked at Sung-jin without performance. "We don't touch it. We don't discuss it. We don't file it under anything useful. Yi Hyun, this is not a negotiation." He stood. "If you bring this back to me in any form, I will take that as information about your judgment, and I will update my records accordingly." Sung-jin left. Yi Hyun stood at his window for a long time after, looking at the city without seeing the grid of it, seeing instead the compound in the mountains. A man with soil-dark hands and a gaze like a level, writing a young man's name onto a photograph as a trust marker for his daughter. "This is someone I trust. Remember this face." He had not earned that sentence when it was written. He had spent 11 years doing things that moved him further from it rather than closer and had not noticed, because no one in his orbit had been positioned to tell him. One dropped photograph. One woman who did not need his approval to know her worth. He had a long way to go. He understood that. But he also understood, for the first time with anything approaching clarity, in which direction the distance ran. He picked up his phone. He did not call Sung-jin. He did not call anyone in his network. He made a restaurant reservation for the following Thursday. Real, in advance, in his own name, for one. Chapter 8. The direction she pointed 3 weeks past. Amara noticed the reservation when she pulled her section assignments at the start of the Thursday shift. Kwon Yi Hyun, Table 4. Requested server, Osei A. She read it twice. Then she folded the paper into her apron pocket alongside the photograph. 2 things she carried, both with weight, both, she was beginning to think, worth the carrying. He arrived at 8 o'clock. Alone, without the perimeter of suited men. He wore a dark jacket over an open collar and he looked, she noted this clinically, the way she had trained herself to note things, like a man who had made several decisions and was at peace with at least some of them. He looked at the chair before he sat down. She brought water without being asked, set it down and said, "Good evening." "Evening," he said, and then directly without detour, "Thank you for taking my section." "It's my section," she said. "You requested it." "I know." A pause. "I wanted you to be able to say no. The fact that the request appeared on the assignment sheet at all means the restaurant allowed it. It didn't mean you had to." Amara looked at him for a moment. "No," she said. "It didn't." She handed him the menu. He ordered without looking at it, something modest, and he said please and thank you with the unperformative steadiness of someone practicing a habit rather than auditioning one. The evening passed without incident. He ate. He did not demand. He did not command the air. When she cleared his final course, he placed an envelope beside his water glass. "The table," he said, "all of them." He nodded toward the other servers working the floor. Not a gesture, just overdue arithmetic. She did not argue. She picked up the envelope. Inside was a note folded around the gratuity. 3 lines in careful English. "I am paying attention now. I am aware of how much practice that requires. Thank you for the lesson." At the service station, she read it twice. She thought about her father's Sunday call, the tomatoes in Accra, the compound in the mountains, a handwriting in the corner of a photograph. She thought about a man standing at a pedestrian crossing a beat longer than necessary before turning in the other direction. She thought about the space between understanding a lesson and living it. It was not a small space. She had measured it herself in different territory at different ages. She knew what it cost to cross. When the shift ended, she did not linger at the side entrance. She walked out the front, onto the main street, in the full particular light of a city that had been asking her a quiet question for 8 months. Whether it was worth staying, whether it was worth being known here, whether the year of anonymity had produced anything that couldn't have been learned from a safe distance. She stood on the pavement and considered the question with the same honesty she had applied to everything else. The answer was yes. Not because of him, she was precise about this in her own interior accounting. Not because a man had behaved badly and then slightly better. Not because her father's bet was showing early returns. The answer was yes because she had stood inside this city for 8 months with her name set aside, and she had learned what it felt like to be seen without the apparatus of legacy. She had learned what it felt like to be dismissed. She had learned what it felt like to hold power quietly and choose how to use it. Those were hers now. No one could annotate them or price them or inherit them. They were hers. She pressed her hand to her apron pocket. She thought, Seoul. A little longer, she walked toward the light. The end. Next, please subscribe.